Hi, this is Hawk, and today I'm going to go ahead and show you how we can create an account in the Darena Health app, create a patient, and then link an MCP server so that it can connect with the patient data, retrieve it, use some MCP tools, and generate some information for us. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and create an account. And now I am signed in, and here is my dashboard. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and create a workspace. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and create a standalone workspace. Now, once I create this workspace, what it's going to allow me to do is I will be able to create FHIR resources in that workspace. Specifically, what I want to do is I'm going to be creating a patient there. It's going to create some additional resources like possibly conditions and encounters and things like that. And then we will be able to connect an MCP server to that workspace and have that MCP server read that FHIR data and then perform some operations on it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on next. I'm going to give it a workspace name, maybe something like my workspace. Profile validation, I'll leave it as enabled. I'm going to go ahead and create the workspace. And here is the workspace URL that we show you. You can copy it and store it somewhere. The workspace URL, you can get back to it from the workspace settings so it doesn't disappear. So you don't have to store it anywhere right at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my workspace. At this point, I have no patients. Now to get started, I'm going to go ahead and go into the import data tab here on the left-hand side. I'm going to go into the sample data and import Alice Newman. In the sample data, we have other ways to import it, like a large set of CCDAs or small, or even a FHIR bundle. We provide this functionality so that you could get started quickly on some FHIR data without you having to go and sort of creating this on your own or using some other external tool. Obviously, you can go ahead and do that. You can always go into the import data tab here yourself and upload your own data, but we're just going to go ahead for this demo and import Alice Newman. All right, Alice Newman has been imported successfully. If I go into my patients tab now, notice that Alice Newman is now here as a patient. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set up an MCP server. This MCP server will then be able to grab the FHIR resources for this patient via an MCP tool and then perform some operations on it. So to get started, on the left-hand pane, we have this AI menu, and under that menu, we're going to go into models. There are two ways that you can configure your AI models. One way is to use the Azure models if you have one, and the other way is to use GitHub models. For this demo, I'm going to go ahead and set up GitHub models. The way to do that is you would need to go into github.com and log into your account. You would need to go into your account settings, go under developer settings, and then add a access token. Now, I already have a tab opened to that particular page, and we are going to go ahead and add that token. So I'm going to go ahead and generate a new token. For my token name, I'm just going to give it like a demo token. And we don't really need a description. The expiration could be whatever you desire. I'm going to put it at 60 days. The important part of creating this token is the model's access. So for this, you need to have read only. That will allow the app that is using this personal access token to be able to access your AI models. Otherwise, you won't have that access. And I'm going to go ahead now and create that token or generate it. Here is a pop-up. I just need to confirm and generate that token. And here is my token. I'm going to go ahead, copy that value, go back into my other tab. In the GitHub token, I'm going to paste that value, select enabled for my GitHub models, and then click on save. Now my GitHub models is enabled, and we should be able to use the LLMs to be able to access that FHIR data for that patient that we have created earlier. In order to test this, I'm going to go into the playground. For the available models, I'm going to choose GPT-4o. We have a default system message. You can change this if you desire, but it's there as a default. And for my message, I'm going to say, what is the age of Alice Newman? Click on submit. I'm going to give it a few seconds. And the LLM has responded that the patient Alice Newman is 55 years old. We know the tokens that were used or the number of tokens. We know how much it cost us to execute this query. and the tool that was used to calculate that age. So what happened behind the scenes is we as a client from here sent a prompt to the LLM. The LLM decided that it needed to use a tool, which was the get patient age tool, because otherwise it does not know how to calculate the age of a patient. And then the client called that particular tool with the information of that patient. The tool was able to retrieve the FHIR data, calculate the age, and we responded back the age to the LLM. And the LLM displayed it here as natural language, as how old that patient is. Now we can also go to the Patients tab here. We can click on the patient, and we are in the patient dashboard. We have a new feature here called Copilot. In here, you are able to interact with the LLM in a chat-specific way. So it is like a chatbot. You are able to ask it questions or other statements or issue statements and prompts, and the LLM will be able to respond back to you. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a new interaction with this LLM. This is similar to chat threads like in Signal or WhatsApp when you have a group. So I'm going to start an interaction, and I'm going to say something like calculate age. This is a title that represents a thread. So it's just a description. You can name it anything you like. Just for demonstration purposes, this is what I named it. I'm going to go ahead and add this interaction. From the model, I'm going to go ahead and select GPT-4o. And in my chat message, I'm going to ask it, what is the age of this patient? Now, I'm going to specifically ask, what is the age of this patient? You would note that I did not specifically say Alice Newman. Why? It's because we are under this patient dashboard and we already have patient context. So this front end is providing this FHIR context over to the MCP server. I will explain a little later in this video how exactly we do that. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and ask this question. And the LLM is able to respond to say that the patient's age is 55. The next thing that I want to do is I want to give it some additional power to this LLM. I want it to be able to retrieve the conditions, or at least able to list the conditions of this patient. If we go into the All Data tab, we can see that this patient has a few conditions, and we want the LLM to be able to list these. If we go back to the Copilot and we ask it, list me the conditions of this patient, the Copilot response is, they currently don't have access to the patient's medical conditions and the provided tools, but in reality, what's really happening is the Copilot just has no way of understanding what conditions are or even how to grab the conditions of this patient. The functionality just doesn't exist. So we already have an internal tool called the patient age tool. The next thing I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to create an additional tool that can grab these conditions by reading the FHIR resources for that patient. The way we're going to do that is we are going to go into the Darena Health open source community repository where other developers can come in, create PRs and contribute to that repository, create their own tools, create their own MCP servers, and have those distributed. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our open source community repository in GitHub and create that tool. So I already have a tab open to it. Our repository is under our organization. So if you do github.com/Darena Solutions, the repository name is Darena Health Community MCP. The README here just gives an overview of what exactly this repository is and what it is meant for. And we have an additional specification that we published here called Sharp on MCP. So we'll review this just a little bit here. What Sharp on MCP is, it's a specification that defines how we can share FHIR context with the MCP server so that the MCP server can access a FHIR server, retrieve data, and perform some operations on that data. So if we go to the specification into the 3 key components part here, it explains a little bit about how we go ahead and do that. So part 1 is the MCP server authentication. It gives an explanation of how a client can connect to an MCP server via client credentials or an API key or some basic authentication or even anonymous access. It depends on how exactly the MCP server implementer wants that authentication. Part 2 is about how actually we send this FHIR context over to the MCP server. In general, it is basically just headers. We provide the FHIR server URL and the access token, other context-related details like the patient ID, the user ID, or the tenant ID. They're all passed in as headers to make it easy for the MCP server to sort of parse it out and actually act on this data. This is similar to CDS hooks as well, where the client has to provide FHIR authentication or FHIR authentication context over the CDS hook. Finally, the FHIR context discovery. This is built on top of the MCP specification discovery endpoint. And essentially, we just indicate, does the MCP server publish some FHIR tools? And if it does, what sort of access does it need? Does it need specific types of scopes and other things like that? So if a client is able to read this discovery document and they are able to read this information and they know that this MCP server has some FHIR tools, the client can send over FHIR context over to that MCP server, like the URL and the access token. But that's just a little bit about what the Sharp-on MCP server specification is. Going back to our community repository, I'm going to go ahead and clone this, but actually I've already cloned this beforehand and I have a local instance running. So I'm going to go ahead and open Visual Studio Code up to my repository here. And here I have it open to Darena Health Community MCP. Now I'm going to go ahead and implement a TypeScript specific tool. So I'm going to go into TypeScript. I'm going to go into our servers page, go into our organization called Darena Solutions. And in Darena Solutions, I have a project called FHIR CRUD, where we do most of our operations. This specific server here is a template server that other developers can take. They can create their own MCP server and they can copy these tools or this code and extend it or modify it, or they don't even have to copy it. They can create their own code as well. But this is a sort of a helper template that can get you started. So in the MCP tools, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that conditions tool that I was talking about that can retrieve conditions and list it out. I'll go ahead and review one of them, at least for the existing tool, which is the Find Patient ID tool. And essentially what this tool does is it takes a first name and last name, and based on the first and last name, it can perform a search using a FHIR search and obtain the FHIR patient related ID and then supply that to the LLM. The LLM can then use that ID to chain it and call other tools that might require an ID. So I'm going to go ahead and create my own tool. I'm going to call it Get Conditions Tool. Over here, I'm going to go ahead and create my class. It's going to go ahead and implement the IMCP tool interface. And then I'm going to go ahead and get all of this set up. Okay, now that I have that set up, I'm going to copy and paste some code here just so we can get started and moving quickly. What I just copied here is some typings in TypeScript. Basically, we just want to be able to type the bundle that will be returned in our search. Next, I'm going to go ahead and create the tool registration. So server.tool. The first parameter is the name of the tool. I'm just going to say get patient conditions. The second argument of this method would be to give a small description of this condition. The description of this tool should be specific so that the LLM can read it and then in its way be able to decide that this is the specific tool to be used under the prompt that it was given. So I'm going to say something along the lines of, this tool finds the conditions of a patient and returns it as an array. All right. And then I'm going to say an additional thing where a patient ID is required for this tool. We need the patient ID, otherwise we don't know how to retrieve those conditions, right? Now there are two situations. One is a patient context already exists. So the client already knows what that patient ID is and it can supply it to us. Otherwise, the client doesn't have the patient context. It doesn't know what the ID is. So possibly the user of the client needs to supply the first name or last name and the LLM needs to obtain the ID using another tool. For example, the Find Patient ID tool. So I need to explain that in this description. So I'm just going to say if patient context already exists, then the patient ID is not required. Otherwise, the patient ID is required. All right. The next thing I'm going to do as the other argument is now I need to supply the parameters that this tool will accept. So we're going to say that it accepts a patient ID parameter. And I'm going to say that it is optional. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and import Zod here. All right. And I'm going to say, see, it is a string and it is optional. And then I'm going to give it a small description. The patient ID optional if patient context exists, required otherwise. Okay. The next thing I'm going to supply it is the actual handler of this. All right. I'm going to take in the patient ID. Now, I'm going to go ahead and copy paste some code here. All right. Let me add my imports. So this piece of code, it returns FHIR context to you. So if the client already has FHIR context, like it already has a FHIR server URL and token, it can supply that context over to the MCP server. So if we go into the FHIR context method, we can see exactly what it is doing. Essentially, it is reading over the headers and checking to see if the FHIR server URL, this specific header name, is available, and it checks to see if the access token is available. If they are both available, we return that information. Essentially, what this allows us to do is the MCP server now has the FHIR server URL where it can go ahead and query for resources, and it has the access token for the FHIR server URL that will allow the authorization required to actually access those resources. So I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to go ahead and continue with my code. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab the patient ID context. So if the client has the patient ID already, then it can also supply this to the MCP server. So if we go into this method, there are two different ways that this can be supplied. So we accept Smart on FHIR access tokens. So if the client supplied an access token to the MCP server, we first try to decode the access token and see if the patient claim exists in the token. If it does, we return that value. If it doesn't exist, the fallback is we check to see if the patient ID header exists. And if that exists, we return that value. So we read from both here. Now for our specific tool, we need a patient ID. So if the patient ID was not supplied or the patient ID could not be retrieved by the LLM, then we say that patient context was not found and we need an ID. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create the actual call. Now I'm going to go ahead and import Axios, which is a wrapper around fetch. And I'm going to go ahead and use the FHIR server URL that was given to us from the context. And I'm going to say, go ahead and retrieve all the conditions for this patient. I'm going to go ahead and make that call. And I'm going to supply the access token that was given to us from the FHIR context. Next thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add in some validation to ensure that we did get some results back. Because if we didn't, we just say that, we couldn't find any conditions for this patient. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to extract those conditions from the response, from the bundle response, and return it as an array. So we're going to assume that the conditions are as display values in the coding of the FHIR resource. And we're going to go ahead and return this as an array. All right, now that that is done, I'm going to go ahead and instantiate my tool and just export this. Get condition tool instance. Now I will want to re-export this in my index here. So I'm going to go ahead and import my instance. All right. So The reason why we are re-exporting here is because in our index in the Express server, we are actually looping through each tool that is being exported here. And by having this index file here that re-exports all of them, makes it easy that we could just loop around each of them and have that done. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run this MCP server. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal here. I'm going to cd into this directory. So we are now here, and I'm going to go ahead and run this server. So I'm going to say npm run start. Now that the MCP server is running on localhost port 5000, we need to be able to make this internet accessible. The Darena Health app is in a hosted location, and for it to be able to access a localhost port here, it wouldn't be able to do that. So one way that we can do this is use a tool called ngrok. What ngrok will do is it will set up an internet accessible URL and then point it to our localhost port 5000 here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Basically, it will allow me or allow the Darena Health app to access it. So I'm going to open up my PowerShell terminal here, and I'm going to say ngrok start all. Now that it has started, we can see that this URL here will point to our localhost port here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL. I'm going to go back into my Darena Health app. I am going to go back into my workspace here, selected. In the left-hand pane, I'm going to open up my AI submenu, and you will see an item here called MCP servers. And in here is where I can add my MCP server. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this button. The endpoint is what we have copied. The transport type is streamable HTTP. We support both SSE and streamable HTTP. We know that SSE is currently being deprecated, but we are going to support both until the community as a whole adopts streamable HTTP and it becomes sort of the standard. We're going to say that our MCP server doesn't really require any additional authentication. It's just an open server at this point for the demonstration purposes, and we're just going to say that it is open. And now I can go ahead and click on this test button. When I click on this test button, what we will do is we're going to make a small request to the MCP server and just say we want to list the tools that are there. So I'm going to go ahead and click test. And I can see that this call was successful. And I can also see that here is the new tool that I have added, get patient conditions, which will return the list of conditions. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I'm going to click on save to ensure that this configuration is saved. I'm going to go back to my patients tab here. I'm going to click on Alice Newman, and it's going to open up the patient dashboard. I'm going to go back to Copilot, and we can see the history of our conversation with the Copilot here. I'm going to click on GPT-4o just to be sure that this model is selected. And I'm going to say now, I'm going to ask it the conditions again. Okay. So whereas this call has failed previously, and the Copilot didn't understand what exactly I was asking it, I've asked it the same question, and now it is able to call that tool that we have created. It lists these conditions of the patient. All right, that was a small overview of how we can create a workspace and how we can add a patient to that workspace, link an MCP server, allow that MCP server to read some FHIR data of the patient, and additionally add features within that MCP server, create additional tools, and customize it in how we want it to read that FHIR data, and also how we want it to process the FHIR data. Hopefully you have found this video helpful, and thank you for watching.